Migration and humanity had been front and center at the UN throughout 2016. Events such as the World Humanitarian Summit in June brought the international community, again, governments, the UN, civil society, the private sector, together in the interest of humanity. Two of the summit's slogans were "Leaving No One Behind," a commitment to address forced displacement, which comes from the Agenda for Humanity, the annex to the report the Secretary General made for that summit. The other slogan was "Restoring Humanity," global voices calling for action. The UN's and the international community's repeated reference to humanity in this context gives credence to the crisis noted in our conference today, but also provides some reassurance that the crisis is recognized and ready to be addressed. My own involvement in this journey began in January when I was persuaded to leave my work on the Syria Commission for Human Rights temporarily to become the special advisor for the summit, leading a small team of secondees at UN headquarters in New York to prepare for the September meeting. Little did I realize that this would necessitate garnering agreement among not only my UN colleagues and the 193 governments, but also civil society, academia, and the private sector. My team, with strong backing from the Deputy Secretary General Jan Eliasson, and welcome advice from many in the system who were knowledgeable about how to move through the stages and compromises of arriving at a document to be approved, first by all parts of the UN, having anything to do with refugees and migrants, plus with all the other partners, and finally, most important, by the 193 member states. We fought through a grueling 7 months to agree on 31 July, the deadline which precedes August UN ambassadorial holidays, to a document that would underpin the 19 September Global Summit addressing large movements of refugees and migrants. We began our task by carrying out extensive consultations with UN agencies, diplomats, NGOs, academics, to produce and work through 5 drafts of a report. Our very patient principal drafter and editor, Beth Ferris, Georgetown professor, survived 50 pages of track changes to each of the 5 drafts. She deserves a lot of thanks. The document, In Safety and Dignity, addressing large movements of refugees and migrants, was shared with governments and others early in April. Discussions then began, led by a brilliant team of co-facilitators and their aides, Ambassador Donoghue of Ireland and Ambassador Karar of Jordan. Their task, impressively performed, was to arrive at the outcome document for New York diplomats to agree upon and forward to their capitals in preparation for the summit and the September General Assembly. Their hard work resulted in this declaration that became the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants. All this to say, I was excited to be asked to share here today what had been accomplished in discussions over the past months and eventually agreed upon in a negotiated outcome, namely by consensus of every member state, and entirely focused on benefiting the forcibly displaced, to those to whom I had devoted the last 35 years of my life. Additionally, I thought how gratifying it would be to convey to another audience what had been achieved, given all the activities, the documentation, and the reports that had accumulated over the year. I must admit that American election events throughout the year, particularly statements by some candidates and their parties and coming from the debates and the editorials and the slogans, gave me and my coworkers pause. Still, watching the 193 heads of state come together in September to agree on how to address large movements of refugees and migrants in safety and dignity kept us hopeful. I do believe the New York Declaration is a seminal international achievement, one that will be built upon and continue to inform debate and policymaking around the world. Despite setbacks in human rights accomplishments and peace-building results this past year, there were corresponding successes in treaty making and state building, and now we had the world's heads of states agreeing to begin further work toward 3 concrete results, which I'll describe. 2 global compacts would be produced over the coming 2 years, one which would involve beginning immediately to develop a comprehensive refugee response plan, covering reception, admission, support for immediate and ongoing needs, support for host countries, and communities and durable solutions, to be formalized in 2018. and the other compact on safe, orderly, and regular migration, to be adopted in 2018 at an intergovernmental conference. And third, the Secretary General of the UN himself launched a campaign against xenophobia under the rubric, Together, Respect, Safety, and Dignity for All. A somewhat extraordinary ask today in today's political climate. The campaign is being led by the UN Department of Information offices all over the world, with enthusiastic involvement from many partners, including the private sector, many advertising agencies eager to get in on this, at community levels as well. UN messengers of peace and goodwill ambassadors are engaging the global public and promoting the aims of the campaign, and information packages are being distributed to anyone to take further action at local and regional levels. Please do check out the website at together.un.org. It's in 6 languages, and it's intended to inspire participation all around the world. And soon there will be mention of the Camden Conference on the website. But can the euphoria, for that's how those of us involved in the negotiations felt, perhaps prematurely in September, and the optimism about the future for refugees and migrants, can these be maintained under the circumstances we're facing, we, especially here at home, and in many places around the world, where refugees, migrants, and vulnerable minorities continue to face discrimination, maltreatment, and worse? Was the Global Summit yet another UN and member state instance of celebrating having reached agreement on a non-binding statement which will be set aside and largely ignored? This had been on the minds of government representatives when we began discussions last year. They themselves insisted on this negotiated outcome, meaning the one to which they all had to agree and sign up to. And I quote them. They said, "We don't want this summit to be another one that produces a document which will sit on a shelf and be forgotten." And we thought that was a good sign. But allow me to describe some of the actual commitments made by the 193 government representatives, as well as the continuing follow-up in UN New York and at other UN agency headquarters around the world, and in many countries, including among civil society actors, academia, and the private sector. I believe the commitments constitute not simply an abstract sound-good list, but are serious and exceptional promises which were meticulously discussed for all those months and argued to be agreed upon, word for word, by all governments. First, so my slides can come up. In summary, commitments that apply to both refugees and migrants, and listed in the straightforward PowerPoint you're seeing behind me for ease of reference. The approach to both refugees and migrants will be comprehensive, sensitive, and people-centered, ensuring sensitive, humane, dignified, gender-responsive, and prompt reception for all persons arriving in our countries, with full respect and protection for human rights and fundamental freedoms. You can see why I apologize for this from the beginning. And I have to say, among the various groups that commented on everything, the EU group was very interesting, being 18 countries or 28 countries being represented, and every line had to be commented upon about 18 times each time we talked about it. It was most interesting. We will address, in accordance with international law, the special needs of people in vulnerable situations. This is the next slide, not the first slide. Including women at risk, children, minorities, older persons, those with disabilities, indigenous people, trafficking and smuggling victims. We'll implement border controls, procedures in conformity with international law, including human rights law and refugee law, and promote international cooperation as a matter of security. Another very important one that we talked a bit about last night and others with us this morning, we will collect accurate information on refugee and migrant movements, identifying nationalities and their reasons for movement. We'll protect the human rights and the fundamental freedoms of persons in transit and after arrival, and offer capacity building for receiving countries when requested. We'll strengthen search and rescue mechanisms by intensifying international cooperation mechanisms. Children should seldom, if ever, be detained. We wanted never be detained, But we barely got this one through over objections of only one government, and that was the United States government. So we got something, but not what we'd wanted, and there was only that one pushback. Root causes such as poverty and conflict will be addressed through the humanitarian development nexus and in coordination with peace building, and there will be cooperation across institutional mandates. UN bodies often need this reminder, and the new Secretary General has instituted some interesting structural changes to accelerate this, reaching this goal. Adequate, flexible, predictable, and consistent, as this describes one of the major drawbacks to assisting the forcibly displaced, humanitarian financing. Now, at best, at around 50% when we're lucky for the appeals that go out for all humanitarian activities around the world, the emergencies. Though this will be provided to host communities through close cooperation among member states, the UN, and international financing institutions, the World Bank and others. Xenophobia, racism, and discrimination will be addressed through improving integration and inclusion by offering newcomers access to education, health, language training, and jobs. National, civil society, private sector, and workers' organizations will work together to counter this trend. These are demanding promises, but more were to come from each of the groups, refugees and migrants, so please bear with my list a little bit longer. For migrants, one of the most important things to say is that migration should be a choice, not a necessity. And if we can look at the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development with its 17 goals, it provides some guidance on this lofty goal. The positive and profound contributions to economic and social development made by migrants should be recognized. Examples are the creation of global wealth, migrants' fresh and in-demand skills and dynamism, and they're filling demographic and labor shortages in aging societies and skewed workforces. Think of the comments that Angela Merkel made often about taking in the million refugees that she brought in. Costs of labor migration and the cost of remittances, which are the mainstay of many less developed countries, should be reduced. Migration must be integrated to global, regional, and national development plans, as well as to humanitarian peace building and human rights policies and programs. An international convention should be ratified, while existing initiatives such as migrations in countries of crisis, the Nansen Initiative, and the principles and guidelines set forth by the Global Migration Group should be welcomed and followed. Particularly welcome this past year is the enhanced cooperation on migration issues created by last year's entry as a related organization in the United Nations of the International Organization of Migration, the IOM. Finally, we've already had a UN resolution on 30 January this year, which decides that the Global Compact for migration will be adopted at a conference at UN headquarters, New York, held at the highest possible level to result in an intergovernmentally negotiated and agreed outcome for a global compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. And this will be accepted at the 2018 General Assembly. Further details are discussed on getting a stocktaking in Mexico in November this year, informal, interactive, multi-stakeholder hearings between April 2017 and June 2018 with non-government organizations, civil society, academics, parliamentarians, diasporas, migrants, migrant organizations, and the private sector, while intergovernmental negotiations will begin in February 2018. I just want to prove to you that there is follow-up on all those abstract commitments that were made, and there is going to be action taken all the way through, at least until 2018, and that will be taken forward. On the refugee side, although I'll leave most of this to Kelly later today, the attention will be called, again, to the 1951 Refugee Convention, to which there are 148 states parties, as well as to the OAU Refugee Convention and the Cartagena Declaration, as well as equitable sharing for hosting and supporting refugees. The comprehensive refugee response plan will be developed, led by the Office of the High End Commissioner for Refugees, as a multi-stakeholder effort involving national, local, and international organizations, civil society, international financial institutions, the private sector, the media, and of course refugees. Again, we all have to work together. Administrative barriers to refugee admissions will be eased, and admission accelerated with early registration and documentation, and children will be given special attention. Efforts will be made to decrease statelessness, to reduce camps, to support hosts and devise early solutions through return, new legal pathways, expansion of resettlement and humanitarian admissions, temporary evacuation, family reunification, private sponsorship, and education opportunities. You see, there are many things that we can do. We do have ideas. We just have to get on with it and do them. We have to have the political will. Attempts will be made to enlist regional and local banks, along with international financial institutions, bilateral financing, private sector, and civil society to address environmental, social, and infrastructural rehabilitation where there are large numbers of refugees. So I hope I haven't stolen any of your thunder, Kelly. That would come from some of your colleagues in Geneva who helped me put that part together. Finally, a few words on developments since September. For refugees, UNHCR has proceeded immediately to begin to develop the plan, the Comprehensive Refugee Response Plan. Identifying refugee situations will be the first examples. They've identified official pilot countries and are in discussion with many others. It's also well on its way to the plan to be adopted in 2018 as a just and predictable way forward to address future large refugee movements. And we're looking forward to Kelly's description of some of this, I think. Negotiations have continued as well regarding the intergovernmental process toward the Global Compact on Migration, discussing who will be the co-facilitators, this important group that comes from ambassadors themselves to bring the other ambassadors together for the September 2018 conference, scheduling the time and place of meetings for the conference, and appointing, we hope soon, I had hoped to be able to give the announcement today, but I don't think it's ready yet, of who's going to be the special representative of the Secretary General for international migration. Finally, the third pillar of the Global Summit, the campaign against xenophobia, launched by the previous Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, and now under the guidance of Secretary General Antonio Guterres, someone who, as a previous High Commissioner for Refugees, as well as Prime Minister of Portugal and many other things, can be counted on to know what he needs to be done and how to go about it. I think all this bodes well for actions that will be taken by the UN and its relevant institutions, along with the initiatives by government, civil society, academia, and the private sector, each group moving alongside and in support of the others toward the common goal of improving humane and realistic responses to the movements that will continue out of necessity of refugees and migrants. Many involved individuals and organizations are determined to follow through on the work done over the past year and to ensure that the wide-ranging commitments made in September at the Global Summit will be met. These are actions we can already observe and appreciate, and that prove there is life after a UN Global Summit and a member state declaration. Still, we here in the United States cannot ignore what appears to be a threat to the very promises made, not only at the UN Summit on 19 September, but also at the 20th September Leaders Summit on Refugees, called for by President Obama and co-chaired by Canada, Ethiopia, Germany, Jordan, Mexico, and Sweden, and the Secretary General. This was an invitation-only gathering of states that made significant pledges to provide financing, resettlement places, and educational opportunities for refugees. Pledges were made by hundreds of member states all throughout the day and into the late evening, and I know because I was the last in line to occupy the Secretary General's seat, so I had to stay till the end. The decidedly unfriendly policy of the new US president and many of his close advisors and some of the public toward refugees and migrants is worrying indeed. And aside from demonstrations at first large, widespread, and extremely creative, and signing petitions, we're pondering responses and how to coordinate them and make them meaningful. We also need to reach out to those who would be willing to convey our messages to others who can influence opinions and decision at the highest level of our government. I have lived and worked outside the United States for more than 40 years, and even over my last few years at home in Chicago, I've continued to travel for and be more involved in issues overseas. Therefore, it would be presumptuous for me to recommend how to overcome what appear to be some of the current obstacles to doing the right thing for people who are on the move only because they have no other choice. I do believe, however, that there are many solutions available if only we have, as I've mentioned, the political will and the goodwill to pursue them. I am in fact heartened by my email being awash in invitations to events and demonstrations and meetings and lectures and fundraisers sponsored by multiple diverse groups who care about those who are needier than we, who, for the most part, can expect to live in peace, safety, and freedom, and we heard from our earlier speakers, and ought to be eager to share these privileges with those who do not enjoy them. Attention continues to be paid to refugees and migrants, but are our efforts weakened in the United States by the current political climate? I venture to say no, as I reflect on the actions underway in the UN and in capitals and communities around the world, including here in the US. Those of us involved and interested must do our best to keep these issues front and center, to counter the negative reactions from some across the economic and geographical spectrum. Hence, my thrill, as I mentioned earlier, to learn of this year's Camden Conference, an important example of reinforcing the way forward, of emboldening those who wonder what can be done, and those who have ideas and drive to act. So I hope all of you in the audience, present and further afield, will adopt this spirit and take this solidarity and some practical ideas into your own venues, working with others to promote both positive views of people on the move and concrete actions to address the needs of others less fortunate than ourselves. I thank you.